Hey, hello everybody. We are live now. Thank you so much for coming. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Um, just to start, I'm gonna give like some background information. So today we are gonna be having a live. It's Earth Day. We are gonna be talking about the links between food production and sustainability, or our ability to feed future generations. I am Carolina Galvani. I am Sinergia Animals founder. And before I founded Sinergia, I used to work as an investigative journalist. And actually, my first assignments were related to the environment and social issues related to livestock production in Brazil. So I'm very passionate about protecting our forests and our indigenous peoples as well. So I think it's something worth mentioning as today's Earth Day. And today we have here Lasse Bruun. Lasse is the UN Foundation's Director for Climate and Food. He's an advocacy expert on food systems, energy transition, sustainable agriculture, and social justice, with 20 years of experience in leadership, development, campaigning, and movement building. And prior to joining the UN Foundation, Lasse built 50 by 40, which is a global NGO coalition bringing together 70 organizations across 45 countries, working on these issues that we mentioned previously as well. So the idea today is that we are going to have questions for Lasse. I would like to remind everybody that you can leave questions for him as well on the chat, and we will try to cover everything we get. And so I'll leave it with you now, Lasse. I don't know if you want to start by saying something.
Yeah, thank you so much, Carol, for having me, and thanks to Sinergia for inviting me today. And it's Earth Day, and happy Earth Day, I guess. It's great to be here, and it's always a good opportunity and occasion to talk about some of the issues we are facing. And as I mean, the linkage between social justice, climate change, and livestock issues has always been a big passion of mine. And I'm glad now to be in a position within the UN Foundation where I also can continue that work there down the line. So yeah, I look forward to a conversation today, and I'll do my best to answer all questions. I cannot promise I'll answer all questions, but I'll do my very best at least.
Thank you so much, Lasse. I can try to comment as well, especially if it's related to Brazil. I think I have experienced a lot of the issues here. So yeah, we already have some questions to start with, but I look forward to receiving more. Interaction is always great. So the first one is that if there is scientific proof of the bad effects of animal agriculture, and why is it so difficult to shift policies that will change production and consumption of meat and dairy?
Yeah, that's the quintessential question, isn't it? And it would be easy to start pointing to some of the big corporations that are blocking this change, and they play a huge role. But there's also like a bigger aspect that we need to address, and I think in a nutshell, one of the problems is that we are still operating under a food system that was developed during colonialism. First colonialism, then after Second World War, there was this race to maximize food production and yield across the world. And of course, since it was the power holders that developed this perspective, that the power holders are the ones who's gaining for it. So that means that a lot of the industrialized countries in Europe and North America has been, profiting from using resources from other countries, including Brazil, but also particularly African countries. So the whole system is kind of like set up to that. And that also includes the funding streams. I know Sinergia as part of this great coalition working on changing funding streams and in like the World Bank, the Monetary Foundation, and the African Union, African Development Bank, and so forth. And I think that's great. And I think it's the that's one of the biggest blockages we're seeing now, is the big funding, both at a multilateral level, so like the international, the MDBs, so to speak, the multilateral development banks, but also at a national level and even at a municipality level. A lot of the funding is going into the wrong systems. And that's difficult to deal with. And it's so ingrained in the food system today. So even if everybody woke up tomorrow and said, let's try to change the world and not change the way we produce the food, all the mechanisms that already are locked in terms of trade agreements, in terms of funding already given with like 10, 15, 20 years implementation, it's really difficult to turn around. So that's also why there's been so much focused in the last 5 or 6 years to look at food systems, and not just agriculture, but food systems more generally speaking. And that's been difficult. The UN Food Systems Summit a few years ago tried to deal with that, and brought together stakeholders to address all issues of like consumption, dietary guidelines, biodiversity, social justice, job creation, ethical issues, and in terms of equitable food distribution and dealing with hunger. And it was great, but most of all, it just demonstrated that there's so much work to do, and it's difficult. So even when we come up and say, well, most people know by now it's at least 15% of all emissions, and I'm just going to say, just for those 2 people in the world that hasn't heard it yet, it's the equivalent of all transportation. So like all cars, boats, planes, buses, ships together, there are more emissions than all that from the livestock sector. So even though that's such a big issue, dealing with all the complexities of the food system and the financial flows is just very difficult. And that's why we need to really deal with this from a systemic approach.
That's great. Would you be able also, like you spoke about emissions already, but do you have like any other very relevant information that you think that explains why we need to move away from this current system that we have, that is so reliant on grains and animal protein, to a more plant-based food system? Are there any other things that you think everybody should know? Any very important data?
Yeah, and I actually have just a few slides I wanted to show, if that's okay, because they really kind of one picture speaks more than 1,000 words. And I think, let me just get this up here. Let me try not to be that person who cannot work the system. Let me just see here. I am now officially that person.
I can see present here at the bottom of the screen. I don't know if you can see.
Yeah, it's not it. It's like it doesn't open up for my PowerPoint presentation, which is the one I wanted to use. But you know what? I can just find the pictures here. Let me just give you a second here. Okay. Happy Earth Day. Thanks, Caroline. Let me just find it here. 2 seconds.
Can wait. I would like to remind everybody who's watching, if you have questions, please share them with us. We'll try to cover all questions that are asked by the audience.
So you should be able to see my screen now. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, great. I wanted to show this on a PowerPoint, but for some reason that didn't work. So just to touch base on the emissions, and this picture here, I think, shows it quite well. If you look at some of the biggest producers, and mind you, this is like, I think 3 or 4 years old, this picture now. It's actually worse now than this is the case. If you take some of the biggest producers in the world, JBS, that you particularly will know if you're based in Brazil, Tyson Foods, Cargill, Dairy Farmers of America, and Fonterra, the emissions from their production together is more than, if you look at, for instance, ExxonMobil, which has always been hailed as the big culprit in the world, or Shell or BP, just to give you a scope of like how big the emissions are. And you know, one of the problems, first of all, there's a problem looking at emissions only, and I can speak to that in a second if that's interesting. But the thing is that we as human beings keep trying to come up with technical solutions to solve the problem, and we've seen that within energy. Within energy production, instead of just focusing on reducing emissions from cars and boats and planes and whatever, and houses, a lot of the work has been put into like how we continue using exactly the same way we do now, but just finding technical solutions. So that has led to carbon capture and storage, like literally machines sucking air down and storing it in the ground, or solar radiation management. Luckily, that hasn't been implemented yet, but there's actually research looking to how can we throw chemicals in the sky that blocks some of the sun so to get less warm, so we can continue to drive our petrol cars and so forth. And one of the things we're seeing within livestock production now is in enteric fermentation, and which essentially is to give cows different additives in the feed. Sometimes it's seaweed, sometimes it's more chemical things, to try to limit the emissions from the animals themselves. And while this might have a tiny effect, it's not a good long-term solution. And I want to make one important point there from my perspective, at least, which is even if you were to solve all the problems tomorrow with emissions from livestock, it still would not address the inequitable food distribution problem, because we cannot continue to eat the same amount of food we're doing in the global north, particularly in G20 countries, and overconsumption of animal protein when it's directly linked to undernutrition or hunger in developed countries. And we cannot continue just to use that much land to grow corn, to grow soy, to feed to the animals or the grazing themselves, when we should be feeding people directly. And that's not even opening the health aspect. So maybe, and is it okay I continue, Carol?
Yes, please do. It's very interesting. Okay. Please do.
Okay. So the other thing I wanted to show here is just this is one of the most depressing pictures in the world. I'm sorry to bring it up on Earth Day, but I think it's important. If you see this here, figure 1 says distribution of global biomass across all mammals and birds. If you look at the mammals particularly, so if you see the gray part of the slide here, which here, that's farmed animals, and the red orange is humans, and the 4% here, the green, is wildlife. So when you think about it, all living wild animals, like all tigers, elephants, giraffes, koala bears, everything, all mammals living on the planet together constitutes only 4% of the global biomass. The rest is human beings and all the animals we are rearing to eat it. So you can see the problem here. And that also another aspect. It's so important to continue to talk about how our insatiable hunger for meat and dairy has led to massive decline in wildlife. And then maybe just to continue with, this is more like, this is depressing and motivating at the same time. This is here about global land footprint. So maybe I can just briefly talk you through it. So if you look at the top one up here, the dark green and those two here. So the big green, that shows all the land that is habitable for all living species, like 71% of the planet, people and animals can live there. The rest is glaciers and like deserts and stuff. Then if you look at within the habitable land, all the land we're using, we have 49% is used for agriculture. The rest is forest and shrubberies and urban spaces and so forth. So you can see out of this, all the land on the planet we can live on, 49% is used for agriculture. So within that, if you look at how much of that, all the agricultural land we have in the world is used for either crop production or livestock. Well, you look at the next one here, and you'll see that 78% of all that agricultural land is used for animals. So that's all the feed, the grain, the grazing, and all the externalities connected to producing meat and dairy. Whereas 22% of the rest is the crop production. So that's like for direct human consumption. And the interesting part that if you then look at how much of the calories does this supply, you would think, well, 78% of all the agricultural land is used for livestock, well, they would probably cover 78% of calories we need, but actually not. They only cover 18% of the calories. That is because it's so intensive, and it's not the way it's produced is not conducive to providing nutrients. And that means that that little piece here of 22% of all the agricultural land in the world actually delivers 82% of all the plant-based food we need, like all vegetables, grains, and so forth we're eating. And then the final thing, just in terms of protein, because then people say, well, it's because, animal agriculture, animal foods are so rich in proteins. Of course, that's important. They cover so much. But actually, if you look at here again, they do cover 37% of all proteins across the world, but the rest, 63% of all protein in the world comes from plants. So you can see the complete disproportionate picture here. But the good news is that if we can start to shrink this piece here, I don't know if my cursor shows here, but in terms of the agricultural land we're using, if we can shrink the amount of land used for farm animals, just imagine how much land that can free up here. So if we just took and moved this to half, if we just cut half of all the animal production today, that would free up so much land that could be used for direct human consumption, but we could also start reforesting that, afforesting that, to enable to have much more biodiversity, to enable particularly indigenous communities and people who live in harmony with nature to not to be disturbed. And it would free up so much land that we could also restore from a climate change perspective in terms of oxygen production and carbon capture, natural carbon capture and storage. And because, to come back to what I said before, there is a really amazing machine, and I'll just stop sharing here. There's an amazing machine that was invented like millions of years ago that takes all the carbon down and stores it in a good way. It's called a tree. So the more trees we can get, the better. I'll leave it there because I spoke for a long time.
That's great. Really great information and really clear about how this change we're talking about would be much better for us as humans, and especially when we talk about feeding future generations. But also I think that would be my next question. Also for people and our economies, and especially like our food security in global South countries. So the question is that we have a question here which asks, what about meat consumption in developing countries or in the global South? Is that something to worry about? And as we know it, this is where like the consumption of animal products is growing the most. So what is your opinion? What needs to be done in global South or low and middle income countries in terms of consumption of animal products?
Yeah, that's a big question, and I invite you to help me answer it, because you are much more familiar working in those territories particularly. But I would say a couple of things. It's difficult because when you talk about energy transition, it's easier because you can talk about leapfrogging, which is essentially skipping over some of the production we did in the global North for so many years. So, like, a good example is in Africa, where almost everybody has a phone now, but they don't have any landlines. They just use mobile phones because they skipped those 30 years or 40 years, where in Europe and North America and other places, they would go through the whole country, put down landlines for communication. That's not necessary anymore. They skipped over that and went straight to mobile phones. So could we think about something similar when it comes to food production? But it's very complicated, and it's also very political, because clearly it is difficult for people like myself living in the global North to come to developing countries, say, well, you shouldn't be eating meat or drinking dairy. It's like, well, you've been doing it for the last 70 years. Who are you to tell us what not to do? And by the way, you doing that creates all the problems we're having with erratic weather patterns from climate change. So how do you do that? And I think I don't have a silver lining solution, but I think it's important to first of all always go into a dialogue with the people who live there, because something that many of the multilateral institutions have been doing wrong over many years have been to go into countries and say, why don't you start this particular production form? It'll be good for you. And like the Green Revolution in Africa has been one of the examples. It was well meant, but it created a lot of problems because, an agriculture model that was suited for European or North American agriculture was trying to be pushed in Rwanda, in Ghana, in Mozambique, and so forth. And it didn't work because the soil was different, the settings were different, and there wasn't an infrastructure for it. And also what it really did was to push smallholder farmers out of business and force them to work for the big producers, many of which are produced for European markets, for instance. So it's difficult. But first of all, it has to be done looking at what is needed, because look at Ethiopia, for instance, in the Horn of Africa. It's a problem. There's a country that has huge problems with hunger, and we need to do something about that. And we've been working for decades to try to solve that problem. And but often, putting in place systems where they are given food aid, which is of course needed because people need to eat in here and now. But the long-term solutions that is running next to the food aid should be focusing on how can we use the local knowledge and the local circumstances. So like in Ethiopia, maybe it's finding better ways of growing teff, which is used for the injera, which is the national food of which it constitutes all meals, most meals in Ethiopia. So how can we work with that? So that's one thing. The other thing is there are ways to look at funding as well, because there's no developing countries, like particularly African countries, who want to go from being in a difficult situation with hunger to becoming a massive polluter. I mean, nobody wants that, right? So it's also, how can we, as a global community, help these countries transition to something that is much better and also builds resilience for the future. And right now, it's not really being done in the right way. But please do add your expertise.
Yeah, I think there are many things I would comment. I will try to remember all of them. I think the first thing I would say is that at least in the countries where we work, Sinergia works in Latin America and Southeast Asian countries. And in these countries, what we see is that actually most, like our traditional way of eating is mostly plant-based. And as our middle classes emerge and we get more international influence, we are changing towards eating more and more animal products. So I wouldn't say that when we talk about reducing consumption of animal products, we are kind of disrespecting our cultures, because our cultures are mostly plant-based already. And that's something we try to remind people. And also, like, we have countries, for example, Brazil and Argentina, where the consumption of animal products is already it's very similar to the levels of consumption we have in the global north. We are very close. The consumption is quite high already. So I think when we look at the global picture, like, there are different studies there saying that, to be able to feed future generations, we have to reduce the production and consumption of animal products by 70 to 90%. We cannot leave the global south out. The global south has to be part of this change. And I think if we do it in a responsible way, our populations are going to be healthier. The health recommendations are very clear. I think everybody anywhere in the world should be eating more fruits, more vegetables, more grains, and more nuts to be healthier as well. So I think if it's done responsibly, it's going to be a win-win for all countries. But of course, as you mentioned, when we talk about even poorer nations, I think we need to be a little bit more careful. So I think our efforts now should be more focused on nations that already have a higher consumption, or that will soon have a very high consumption, because we see the curves and the consumption is growing very rapidly all over South America and Asia, for example. And I think the other thing I would mention, I think when we talk about changing the way we eat or changing our food systems and how much that could hurt people, especially in developing nations or the global south, we have to think about our farmers as well. And here I have, let me see if I can find it, not to get it wrong. Yeah, so currently, smallholder or small farmers represent 90% of farmers and provide more than 80% of the food consumed in the developing world. And what we see with like the big livestock operations is that these farmers are often displaced by like very large and industrial grain operations or livestock operations, because basically they cannot compete, they're too small. And what will happen to these farmers and to the food they produce if we let the big industrial model take over? We are going to have a problem there as well. So I think it's important that we invite people to change and to look at these issues and to take responsibility all over the world. This would be my comments. And that brings me maybe to the next question, and it's related to your first answer, which is about the need of technology. We have some footage there showing big industrial livestock operations. But my question is, as you mentioned, like when we see this big problem we have, like our food system is not sustainable, we need to change it quite dramatically to make it able to feed future generations. A lot of people think about, oh, we need technology. And I would say we don't, because we actually have more traditional ways of producing food that could feed the world in a much more sustainable way. But I would like to hear from you what you think. Do we really need technology to solve the problem, or are there other things we can do?
No, that's a really good question, and really important pictures there as well. Yeah, I think it depends on how you look at technology. I believe some technology is good, but that's quite specific technology. For instance, if you look at food waste is in least developed countries, post-harvest food waste is often a third of everything. So there's a need for like proper storage facilities, infrastructure to transport the food and cooling and stuff like that. So there's a lot that can be done there in a good way. But when it comes to the specific food production, I mean, I think it's the good old conversation about land sharing or land sparing. And just to for those who don't know it, like land sparing, the philosophy behind that is that you take and maximize the output of a tiny piece of land or any size of land, saying, well, why don't we take, let's say we have 20 hectares. Why don't we take 10 of them and we use them really intensively, so we can take the rest 10 hectares and just leave it forest or what have you. The other philosophy says, well, it's land sharing, saying, why don't we integrate the two and make sure we have a production system that works with harmony with people who live there, with nature, with biodiversity and so forth, and doesn't destroy the land, doesn't degrade the land, but actually keeps it healthy, even improves the land. And when you use the land sharing model, it takes more space than the land sparing thing. But here's the thing, it's about perspective. It's about for how long do we need to look at these issues? Because if you look at it from a short-term perspective, let's say 10 years, we need to feed people the next 10 years and we just go full on with intensive production, that might work. But then after that, that land is so destroyed and biodiversity is gone, and there's so many externalities, and there's been like atrocities happening to indigenous communities, like we're seeing in the Amazon rainforest, for instance. That land that soil is going to be unusable and is not a good long-term solution. It destroys so many things. So what we need to do, I think, is to really focus on the land sharing model and use the technology that exists, which is often it's not a technology. It is like the old way of doing things. We talk a lot about permaculture or regenerative agriculture, agroecology, and those are just names. Essentially, that is the way we've been farming for thousands of years. And if done in the right way, you can have more than adequate yields, you can really feed the people, and you can do so in a way that works in harmony with nature. But it's a long-term process, and everything in this world is set up for short-term things. Just look at like politics. Most governments are elected for 4 or 5 years, then it's over. Next one, things needs to change. So it's so important that we take the long-term perspective and say, how do we feed people right now better? How do we also feed people in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 100 years from now? And how do we do that in a way that doesn't destroy the world and biodiversity, indigenous rights, indigenous communities, and so forth? So I would say, if you talk about technology that can, the enteric fermentation I mentioned earlier, like additives for cow feed, is it worth trying? I don't think so, because it's just another attempt to try to change um, something to live the same way we want to do in a destructive way, as opposed to changing the foundations for how we do. And also, when you want to talk about the health aspects as well, like the food safety aspects, the more things over history we've seen, the more things gets pulled into technological solutions like intensive animal agriculture, like CAFOs or battery cage chickens or farrowing crates, or whatever is used in this in modern industry. There's a direct link between that and the increase in antimicrobial resistance in terms of zoonotic diseases. By now it's relatively accepted that COVID and other zoonotic diseases comes from the human-animal interaction in a wrong way. So the more we intensify, the more we rely on that kind of technology, the more problems we'll see down the line. And here's the thing: the solution is actually not bad for the economy, and that's something. And I think you also wanted to maybe address. You mentioned Carolina earlier, but because the everything points to the fact that if we are to transition to a more sustainable food production, a food production that relies more on agroecology, or working in harmony with nature, working with indigenous communities and so forth, the land sharing within a sustainable way, that can create more jobs. Some of you will know there was a study done by the Inter-American Development Bank and the International Labour Organization a few years ago that found that if Latin America and the Caribbean were to transition to more sustainable food production, essentially do a big decarbonization of the food industry, that by 2030, you would see up to 15 million new jobs created by shifting to more plant-based foods. It's not about all of Latin America and Caribbean going vegan tomorrow. It is about making a reduction. So, and that's really important, because one of the big barriers we often meet when we are trying to change things is like, well, where's the money going to come from? What about people's jobs? But if we can make the case, that we actually will be creating new jobs, and actually will be boosting the GDP of a country, it's a good case.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Lasse. I did want to mention the same study about job creation. I think that's a really important one. And there are some other. I recently did some research about the more traditional methods to produce food and how productive they can be. And I was really excited to learn that there is a study which was done, which gathered information from 57 countries. And it shows that agroecological projects covering 37 million hectares have shown to increase average crop yield by 79%. And that for me was so important to see, because even having worked in this field for a very long time, sometimes we do question ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what about if we change, from this industrial system to a system that is more sustainable and done by smaller producers? Will we be able to feed the world? And when I see this type of studies being published, it gives me a lot of hope that we can, and it's actually going to benefit more people. And the people who are really vulnerable, like we really have to worry about small farmers in the developing world, because if we do what we already did in more developed nations, which is to adopt like very industrial models, we will displace them, and that will create social problems. Yeah, so this is the one I would like to highlight.
And maybe if I may just add to that, because something we touched on, but they haven't gone into details on it, is the overall externalities. Because what you and I were just talking about is just from changing to one production to another. But the current externalities, the external costs of the current food production is just through the roof. And I was just pulling up the latest number I'm informed with is 19.8 trillion with a T, trillion dollars are the external cost of the current food production. And that is environmental cost, effects on natural capital. It's the social cost, like child and forced labor, discrimination, harassment, high variable prices, whatever. It's in health, and also the overall economy. So that together, and those are predominantly FAO figures. It's $19.8 trillion that we essentially have in costs that are not accounted for in the food production. And also, as you said, Carolina, if you shift to agroecology, it has so many good things. And also, of course, the health aspects. If you're not exposed to GMOs and pesticides, you will de facto become more healthy. You will have less need for the hospital. So it all makes good sense.
It does. Let me see what other questions we have here. There's so many interesting ones. I'll get this one, which can be a little bit controversial, but I think it's very important. Is quitting the consumption of red meat enough to create the change we need to see?
Oh, you want me to address that?
Yeah, it's a question for you, if you don't mind. I can try
of course.
to cover it as well.
I thought, okay. I was hoping you would take it. No. No. The answer is no. Because red meat is, of course, the most high emission and problematic meats are beef and lamb. And that makes beef the biggest one because lamb consumption is not as big as beef. But here's the thing, another big culprit is unfortunately dairy as well. And you will know most dairy cows, they will go, I think it's in the average is 2.3 cycles, which means that they get impregnated, they go for 9 months like humans, they give birth, and then they're shortly after inseminated, and they can do that in average 2.3 times, and then they're not productive anymore with the milk, and then they're sent to slaughter and become part of the meat industry. So the dairy industry, unfortunately, is really a heavy one. So from an emissions perspective alone, dairy is also a big place where you need to cut down. And then some people might say, well, isn't that why we should be relying more on chicken and fish, because they need less feed, there's less pollution and so forth. From a perspective of emissions, there might be something about that, but that doesn't address all the externalities we talked about before, the unhealthy aspects of the production, and also the fact that particularly the intensive production of chicken and fish are some of the biggest polluters. Like all the waterways are being now, one of the biggest problems is going to be the aquaculture. Like look at the salmon production in Norway, off the coast of the US and so forth. And a lot of the problems we're seeing, for instance, in the Gulf of Mexico with eutrophication, like lack of oxygen in the ocean, is runoff from big farms, including chicken farms. So it is unfortunately not a one-for-one. So if we could say, well, let's just drop red meat and that's good, and have fun with the rest, it has to be in like an overall reduction. And maybe on that, Carola, I just want to mention, I think you said something really important before, that we should look at how people used to eat. And also, like I spent some time in Brazil, and I was always amazed by the Brazilian diet, which traditionally is rice and beans, lots of vegetables and fruit, and some meat. But now, of course, like any other countries, like Brazil is also suffering from an influx of McDonald's, KFC, and so forth. And it's such a pity to see countries that had such a beautiful food tradition, that where people are essentially are healthy, eating the traditional food, are shifting to a food culture that is being important. So the whole cultural thing is a whole other chapter to open as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Leslie. I think the traditional way of eating is very important to remember. And regarding your comments as well, like when I get this question about is it really enough just to stop eating red meat, one thing that really comes to my mind is that it's about land use, because like of course you can farm chickens and fish and in very intensive ways, so you don't need a lot of space, but to feed these animals you will still need crops, which are usually produced in very industrial ways. There's so many problems related to this system. So for example, in Brazil I have participated in investigations that show that soy crops, like they're sprayed by plane sometimes, and it can be done in very responsible ways, and sometimes they spray over schools. There are like really serious cases of kids getting very sick, and that happens in Argentina as well. And we also have, I can mention something here. As you mentioned, we have problems with indigenous communities. So, for example, only in 2019, we did some research and we identified over 30 cases of invasions of indigenous lands by cattle ranchers and crop producers in Brazil. So it's very clear that the system hurts these people. And the thing is that chickens and fish, they will still need soy, they will still need corn. So if we keep eating these animals as well, we are not going to solve the problem when it comes to land use, social issues, because we don't change really the fact that we need to to grow crops industrially to feed animals and pigs, right? Pigs are also very reliant on grain. So I think that's something that I would highlight.
Yeah, and maybe just to add something that always blows my mind, in addition to everything you just said, that it's some of the biggest aquaculture operations, so like farm salmon, for instance. Sometimes it is grain and depending on the prices, but often it is actually wild caught fish that is fed to the salmon. So the big fishing trawlers go out and they like kind of drench the sea for some fish, and adds to the decline of fish population, also for human consumption essentially. And then they pour that into the salmon farms. I mean, it's just mind-boggling when you think about it.
Yeah, no, for sure. When we look at ocean conservation as well, it's very critical that we stop fishing small fish to feed fish farms, because that's surely depleting our fish stocks in many crucial parts of the world. So well remembered. Do you also have the questions there, Lassie? Is there any that you would like to pick up, or should I choose one here?
Oh, please choose one.
Okay. Already covered this one. Yeah, I think this one is a good one. It talks about like individual behavior. So is there a simple dietary change I can make to reduce my climate footprint in the greatest way possible? And the question also comes with the comments that is it only about eating animal protein, or like eating organic or local or seasonal foods is also important?
Yeah, so first on the overall dietary thing, people should do what they can, and it's a journey. It takes time, and I'm gonna be honest. I was not vegan day one. I've been vegan now for 21 years, so it's been a while. But back then, when I became vegan, I followed a very traditional path, I think, which I first gave up pork, then I gave up beef, then I gave up chicken, and then fish, and then dairy. And I was actually vegetarian for 10 years before going vegan. Again, this was like in the 90s, but so it's a journey. It's and nobody should feel that they have to go vegan tomorrow as a kind of a pressure. I think it's about doing what you can and then seeing the benefits of it. Often you can even consider this comparison might work for some, might definitely not work for others, but consider meat like alcohol. If you cannot live without it in the beginning, at least just have it once in a while. You wouldn't drink, most people at least wouldn't drink alcohol every day to have a functional work life. So try as much as you can just to cut down, and then when people start seeing the health benefits of it, start seeing feeling better, also like mentally better, that you're not contributing to an issue. I think for me that would probably be the one way to go. And for the other part of the question, in terms of other production forms, well, I mean, if you are fortunate enough to be able to either grow some of your own food a little bit or have access to affordable organic food, you should definitely do that, because the industrialized agriculture system, including for crops, is not all great. Too many pesticides, too many inputs are being used, and there's a double thing to that. One is like what it does to nature, like putting all the fertilizers in the ground and using heavy pesticides, of course, affects nature, wildlife, the people who work with it, horrible conditions to work in, being exposed to pesticides frequently. And of course, for yourself as well, ingesting all these pesticides is not good for you. But again, it's not everybody is privileged enough to have access to that kind of thing. So try as much as you can, and then there are specific produce that are worse than others. So if you look at it purely from a health perspective, I would personally avoid things that are directly exposed to it, and some of the worst ones are like grapes, strawberries, tomatoes. Those I would definitely opt for going without pesticides if possible. But I mean, and others too. But if you have to start somewhere, it's not like one or the other. It's a process, and do what you can. And then the final thing I want to say, it's often in some countries, I know in Brazil, sometimes you can go to markets and other places and buy produce that is not officially certified organic, but actually might have been produced predominantly organic, with like familiar agricultura familiar. And so there's also, don't always look for, if you feel you have to go into a very expensive supermarket and buy a box of strawberries that's been flown in from somewhere in a big plastic box, that's not a great solution either. But if you can find somewhere that locally where you grow tomatoes, strawberries, or whatever it might you want to be, celery, or whatever you want, and you can talk to them and maybe say, well, we don't use pesticide, we only use neem oil, or we use integrated pest management. We have lots of birds here who eat all the grubs and what have you. So do what you can and look for affordable and good solutions.
That's great, Lasse. Thank you so much. I was just checking the comments here and the questions. So there is one question from Deborah. She's asking us, what about sea life? Could you share your perspective on how your eating habits are impacting our oceans? I think we spoke a little bit about that. Would you have anything to add?
Well, just to keep in mind that there's a big difference between small communities around the world who are dependent on fisheries as currently for consumption, particularly again in many African countries, but also in Latin American and Asian countries. There's a big difference between that and the massive industrial farming systems. If you go to a fancy restaurant in a big city like New York or Paris or whatever, and get a fish there, in all likelihood, it has been caught using very bad ways that is actually destroying the sea. I think it's important for us to move ahead on the thing, to differentiate between what local people eat at a local level and what is the big industrial production. So in some ways, the fisheries aspect, the oceans aspect, is a bit like the CAFOs. I mean, there are the big productions and there are the small ones, and let's start with the big ones.
That's a very good addition. I think we also have at our international website. I'm gonna put it here on the comments. Yeah, we have people helping us. If you could put that on the comments so everybody can see. So we have a page which is sinergiaanimalinternational.org/fishing. There we have some good statistics and some good information about why we should also think about our oceans and our eating habits when we talk about fish. And I think there is one paragraph here that I think it shows like the size of the problem. So basically, most of our fish stocks are already at risk because of overfishing, and around two-thirds or 64% of our fishery resources are already classified as overfished, and 23% of them as fully exploited. So we do have a very serious case there that we need to reconsider our fish consumption as well. And we have a question from Rodrigo. So what do you consider to be the main obstacle to raising people's awareness of environmental preservation associated with ending the consumption of animal products?
Well, that's another really good question. Thanks for that, Rodrigo. I can give it a shot, and also invite you, Carolina, to join in. Two things I can think of. One is focus on the things that matter to people. Whether we like it or not, a lot of people won't care about the ethics of animals. They might care, but they're not going to do anything about it. So some people will be really, affected and can be influenced by showing some of those horrible pictures you showed before of industrial farming. Luckily, more and more people are actually taking that in. But some people, they probably won't think much of it. They will think about it for a few minutes. And often you need to find out how can you engage people. And I think often the financial case is one, and also the social case. There has traditionally been a differentiation between human protection and animal protection, which is unfortunate. It's often been seen as like it's one or the other. Either you're a human rights person or you're an animal welfare, animal rights person. You cannot be both. And I think to me it's clear you can be both, and you should be both. It's about protecting anybody who is unable to protect themselves, and making sure that we have ethical and healthy conditions for everybody on the planet. So trying to break down some of those barriers, I think, is important. And I know that's something Sinergia has done as well. And then that leads to the other point, is like, who's the messenger? I think people are tired of listening to somebody like me talk about animal issues, for instance, because I've been around for a long time and done it. I think it's important that those who are actually more affected by the consequences of overconsumption of meat, particularly from in least developed countries, they're the ones who has to point their fingers at the global north, particularly G20 countries, and saying, guys, you need to cut down on your meat consumption so there's enough space for everybody, including for us to feed ourselves.
Yeah, very good answer. I think so. The obstacle to raise awareness. That's the question. Yeah, what I would say is that I think, like, as individuals, I'm not talking about the organization now, but usually when we try to convince people to reduce or eliminate the consumption of animal products, if we are very passionate about the cause, sometimes we think that giving people a lot of facts will be enough to change their behavior. And I like to use my family as an example. Myself and my brother, we have been vegetarian for over 20 years and vegan for over 10 years. And what we saw is that when we focused a lot on only giving people facts, and especially talking about animal suffering, because that matters to us a lot, people wanted to avoid the issue. They didn't want to look at it. Like, they're like, I don't need to know. For me, it's really difficult to change. I understand and I admire you, but I don't want to know. So sometimes I'm saying that because sometimes it's not only about listing facts, but it's showing people how good your food can be. For example, when we have parties, for example, we always have vegan dishes. And usually we have to run and get the food for us first, because if we don't, like, people are going to eat it all. Like, we won't have any vegan food left for the vegans. So I think like showing people how good our food is, how diverse it is, like how many new flavors you can bring to the table, is one of the most effective ways to help people start to change. So yeah, I think that's really important to say, I would say. And thanks for that question, Rodrigo. I think it's really important.
If I can, I just add something quickly. There is just when you said that, it made me think of something, because there's like this overarching psychological barrier for a lot of people, particularly politicians, to change what they're doing, because you know, when if you say I used to not believe in climate change, but now I believe in climate change. If you do that, it's the same as saying, so the last 15 years I was wrong. And that's hard for people to admit, that they were wrong about something. And that goes to changing the food. If people have been like for years and years saying, oh, this vegan food is like, I don't know, I don't want, it's not for me, I don't want it. But if you then can make the case it's delicious, they can then they if they can say, well, vegan food the way I saw it used to be so boring, but now it's delicious, so now I will start eating more. So it's a good way to entice them, to make them look not stupid for what they did before, because they're not. It's a journey, right? But a lot of people battle with this thing of like admitting they were wrong for such a long time before.
Yeah, it is true. So I think we only have 2 minutes left. It has been like an amazing experience that I'm really surprised to see how fast it went. Thank you so much, Lasse. I think the information shared was so useful and so inspiring. Would you have any closing remarks? Anything that you think, yeah, you would like to share with people to celebrate Earth Day today?
Um, yeah, I think so. And somebody mentioned that already about what you did in the video was to show the bad things, but also how nice it can be. And we need to look at the dark side. We really need to look at the reality, how things are. We cannot just turn around and pretend it's not there. We have to do that. But then we also need to celebrate and embrace all the beauties of it. So Earth Day should be a day where you talk about the difficult things, and then you go and celebrate. So I would encourage everybody to go out now and celebrate with your friends and family, and have some nice, healthy, preferably plant-based food there to celebrate Earth Day, and then feel good about that you are part of the solution.
Thank you, Lasse. We have one last question, which is if I can comment on Sinergia's work to address this issue. So yeah, I'll finish by giving everybody a little bit of hope, because these are facts that bring me a lot of hope. So I hope it can do the same to you. So I think our two programs that work with this issue more closely are our food policy programs. So in countries like Argentina, Colombia, Indonesia, and Thailand, we work with public and private institutions, and we offer them free help and support so they can start serving plant-based meals. And when we do that, I think most of these institutions are schools and universities. We also have the opportunity to talk to students, parents, many decision makers about the importance of decreasing our consumption of animal products, so it can reach a lot of people. And only in the last 4 years, we have been able to work with 40 different institutions in these countries. And every year they serve over 5 million plant-based meals. They have the potential to serve over 5 million plant-based meals. So this is something I'm very excited about. And also, if we have people there in the audience from any Spanish-speaking Latin American country or from Thailand and Indonesia, in these countries, we have vegan challenges. So you sign up, and during 21 days, you will receive free advice from nutritionists, dietitians, and chefs about what are the key things you should know to start eating more plant-based or to shift completely towards a vegan diet if that's what you want to do straight away. So these are very useful programs. And over the last 4 years, we have had over 150,000 people taking these challenges with us. So, and we know that they also have the potential to inspire many others around them. So I think that that's creating good change as well. And if you want to learn more about our work, you can visit our website, which is sinergiaanimalinternational.org. There you can also become one of our volunteers or online activists who take action every week to help animals and the environment. And if you want to do even more, there's also an option there to donate. So it's sinergiaanimalinternational.org/donate. And you can either make one single donation today to celebrate Earth Day, or you can become a monthly donor. The two options are available there.
Can I just make a quick comment?
Mm-hmm.
Just in terms of motivation, I think it's very motivating and see what Sinergia has accomplished. When you think about that, it was nothing but an idea 5 years ago in your head, and now it's a global organization. That is very inspiring, because that shows with willpower and tenacity and just working hard, you can actually make a really big difference. So you don't all need to come from rich families or have impact investors lined up or something like that. Sometimes just get the right idea and work hard.
True. Thank you so much, Lasse, for the kind words. So thank you so much, everybody, for coming. Happy Earth Day. Have a great weekend. And thank you, Lasse. Thank you so much for being with us here today.
Thanks for having me. It was fun.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.